It appears that the voters exhibited a distinctly anti-government mood in the midterm elections. Riding a surge of voter discontent, Republicans seized control of the Senate, giving the GOP full command of Congress. Will the final 2 years of the Obama presidency be even more contentious than the first 6? Or will a truly divided government require the parties to work together to show that they can govern responsibly? We'll discuss the results of the November midterm election and how it will impact the state and the San Joaquin Valley with Republican Congressman David Valadao and Democratic Congressman Jim Costa. The 2014 midterms, implications for California and the San Joaquin Valley.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From the California Channel at the state capitol, Valley PBS, and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. Well, it's finally over. After months of campaigning, the voters have spoken, but what exactly did they say? And will the political climate change in Washington, or can we expect even more gridlock? We're fortunate to be joined by 2 United States congressmen to discuss those and other issues. They are Democratic Congressman Jim Costa and Republican Congressman David Valadao. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks. Well, Congressman Costa, let's start with you. So what's your takeaway of the November election?
Well, I think that the voters across the country were trying to say, look, we're really frustrated, and I think you could take a lot of messages out of it. They're unhappy, obviously, with the president, but beyond that, I don't think they're very happy with Congress. And they'd like us to get some things done. There was certainly an anti-incumbent mood that carried across the country. And I think that a disenchantment really reflected by the poor voter turnout. I mean, in California, we may have a record low turnout of 30% of the voters eligible, which is really a sad commentary.
Congressman Valadao, what is your takeaway?
There's a lot of agreement there. Obviously, there's a big push against the president in the agenda currently, and there was a lot of people that just avoided voting. It was one of the lowest turnouts, and it was a little bit of a surprise to many of us how low the turnout was. So people weren't excited about being part of the process, and so we've got to do a lot more in the next 2 years to get people paying attention and working, and at least showing up to vote.
Okay, so Congressman Costa, your election was a lot closer than people expected. Why do you think that happened?
Well, I think it was turnout primarily. The fact is that 2 years ago we had over 60% voter turnout. I spoke with Brandy Orth at the Fresno County Elections Office yesterday, and she indicated that we have a 28% turnout now in Fresno County. When they count the 42,000 votes that are out there, she's hoping they'll get to 32%. But statewide—
And it was 60%?
Yeah, last year. I mean, 2 years ago it was over 60%. So that's a dramatic difference.
What about high-speed rail? It used to have bipartisan support. It seemed to have become a wedge issue in the Valley. Do you think high-speed rail played any role in the midterm elections?
Not really. I mean, there was obviously a lot of opposition in the Valley, that's to be sure. You know, I mean, Governor Brown won hands down, and his opponent tried to make an issue out of it. You know, I think people, I don't see it as a wedge issue in the way that we see other issues, I guess.
Okay. Well, Congressman Valadao, you and your Republican colleagues did quite well in the Valley, but why do you think the Republican success in the Valley failed to translate to the state as a whole?
Well, the Valley is a little bit different than the rest of the country, especially the rest of California. The Valley, things like Endangered Species Act that have affected our water, our energy production, are things that really play into the process. And Democrats here in the Valley, especially on the water side, have seen how bad those policies have affected us. And the Bay Area and LA just don't feel it the same way our voters do, our constituents do. And I think that had a big, big role in it. I think that's why a lot of outside groups don't understand the Valley quite like those who live here do. And
I'm assuming a lot of people were thinking of Prop 1 and the water bond to vote here in the Valley. Congressman Costa, let me ask you, so we're talking about the apathy in the midterm elections, a record low voter turnout. Is that what's going on here, or is there some fundamental political shift going on in the Valley?
Well, I mean, I think turnout has a lot to do with it. I mean, you can look over the last 4 elections, and you know, I mean, we've had reapportionment. That's had an impact, of course, both at state legislative seats as well as the congressional seats. And I think the Valley, you know, it tends to, you know, be provincial and I think those that can connect best with the Valley, I think it's one of the reasons that Congressman Valadao did so well in his reelection. It makes a difference. He's in a Democratic seat, registration-wise, but yet he does very well. So I think at the end of the day, it's how you connect on the issues that are critical: agriculture, water, taking care of your folks.
Okay, Congressman Valadao, let me then ask you this question. What do you think the political climate's going to be in Washington with the new Congress when it convenes in January? Are we going to see more conflict and gridlock, or is there going to be an attempt to actually work together?
No, there is, but especially right now, there's obviously a lot of excitement because of what happened in the Senate. Republicans in the House and even a lot of Democrats in the House feel like the Senate hadn't moved a lot of bills forward. There are a lot of proposals in that stack of almost 400 bills sitting on Harry Reid's desk that never had the ability to go to the president's desk. And now with the change in leadership, we should be able to see some more bipartisan bills go forward, because you still need to get through the 60-vote majority threshold to get bills to the president's desk. And I think there's going to be a lot of bipartisan support to get some of those bills forward, especially the ones where we all agree on.
Yeah, I can give two takes on that. One, as David said, which is the optimistic scenario. I think Mitch McConnell said yesterday we're not going to have a government shutdown and we're not going to play with the debt ceiling, which are the right things, I think, to say. And President Obama said yesterday that we got to work together, which are the right things to say. Now, the facts will play out next year as to whether or not there's the follow-through. And so whatever bourbon they're drinking tomorrow, I hope it's good.
Well, it'll be Kentucky bourbon.
It certainly will be Kentucky. But the fact is that we need to work together. The American public wants us to work together, and when we don't, it's not good for America. So I'm hopeful that the next 2 years will be productive. It should be. But you could also point a scenario where we would go back to the status quo, and that would not be good.
Okay, well, when we come back, we're going to talk about some of those possible issues where Republicans and Democrats can find some common ground. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Republican Congressman David Valadao and Democratic Congressman Jim Costa about the upcoming Congress in light of the Republican gains in the November midterm elections. Well, Congressman Valadao, repeal of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, has been a Republican priority for some time. Will the Republicans go to repeal Obamacare, or will they propose an alternative? And if there's an alternative, what is it going to look like?
Well, there's been some proposals floating around out there. There's one that even Congressman Nunes here in the Valley has been talking about quite a bit, that he worked with the senator from Oklahoma that just retired. But there are some ideas out there. As far as proposals to repair, change Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, there is a lot out there. And in fact, I co-authored one. There's a few that were introduced at the very end. But there's a lot of ideas out there. If it repealed a mandate, there's things like that that are beneficial for here in the Valley. There's ideas that are always floating around, and I think there is a lot of room to go there. As far as the full repeal, we saw Majority Leader just the other day mention that right now that's not on the top of his list. So we are seeing some comments where the goal is to just fix, and fix is probably the best solution right now.
Okay, so do you see, Congressman Costa, any bipartisan efforts to reform health care reform?
Well, I think there are some items that we could work on, but whether or not we get critical mass remains to be seen. But other areas, the trade agreements, the TTIP with the European and U.S. negotiators is moving along, as is the Asian trade agreement. I think there's potential for tax reform agreement that we can reach. We're hopeful that the efforts that David and I have been involved on providing greater operational flexibility on the federal water projects will come to fruition. And so I think there are areas in the next Congress that we can work together on. To be sure, there will be differences.
You know, it's interesting. Let's follow up on the water issue, Congressman Valadao. Do you see the Republican Congress providing any help to California in the way of money to deal with the water issue?
And there is an opportunity there. I do sit on House Appropriations. Senator Feinstein also sits on Appropriations in the Senate. Yes, I do believe the opportunity is there. That is something we're always looking for. Resources are tight. In the last appropriations bill that was passed, there was some funding for some water projects around the country, and hopefully we'll be able to push some for here in the state. The water bond passing this past election cycle is actually one improvement that could be very beneficial here in the Valley if we see some of that money spent quickly.
Yeah, and a takeoff on the water bond. Murkowski was talking about earlier this year doing a Western states authorization for water projects. And so hopefully that will get some momentum next year with Senator Feinstein. And obviously there may be an opportunity here to match that state funding.
Well, what about the governor's Twin Tunnels project? Do you see with the whole Delta issue is another big issue besides dams. Do you see any federal support for that?
Just depends on how the project comes to play. Right now, the numbers that we're seeing, it's going to be a tough lift, especially when there is an opportunity to get water through the Delta without building that. I mean, the operational flexibility would be a benefit, but as far as the dollar amount that we see floating out there now is one that is going to be a little controversial in Washington.
I think, though, the governor did say last week in a speech in Stanford, which I continue to push him on, is that we've got to fix this broken water system, and it's going to take years, and it's going to cost billions of dollars. And I sent him an email after I read his comments in the speech. I says, and it's important that you provide the leadership in your next term to move forward on fixing this broken water system. And too often on this issue, we're lacking profiles and courage. So he's got to hang in there. He's got to provide the leadership. A lot of us will help him if he does.
Let me ask you about the congressional districts. They're probably going to stay the same through the census in 2020. So political scientists are saying they're probably going to have a Republican majority in the House until at least 2022. So Congressman Costa, let me ask you, California's trying to build high-speed rail. It's the largest infrastructure project in state history, one of the largest in the nation's history. Can they do it without any federal support?
I think in the near term, yes, and notwithstanding the reapportionment, I think the majority of the House is likely to stay in Republican leadership. But the governor is committed to moving forward on this, and there's private investment that is being interested in the first 142-mile segment, and the cap and trade funds provide continuous funding beyond that. This is, to be sure, a 20-year project, and if the High-Speed Rail Authority continues to work in improving their relations with in the right-of-way and the other efforts, I think there's an opportunity to build on support.
Let me ask you about infrastructure projects. That's another area that there might be grounds for compromise, fixing the highways and the bridges and the roads. Do you see any new initiatives in that regard?
Well, I hope so. I mean, we passed a Band-Aid for the transportation reauthorization for, I think it's to August of next year. We need to have a certainty of a 5 or 7 year transportation reauthorization. I've never seen a bridge or a road that's Republican or Democrat. The disconnect is that it takes money. And the source of revenues on the federal side for funding these infrastructure projects, which we must do, it's about $1 trillion investment that we got to be doing. We're living off our parents' investments, is declining because of the more fuel-efficient vehicles and alternative fuel vehicles.
What do you think, Congressman Valadao? Do you see infrastructure projects and bipartisan support for that in the next Congress?
Yes, there are a lot of members who need projects built in their districts as well, and they're starting to feel the heat from their constituents. And if it's a road, if it's a bridge, whatever it may be, but there is a lot of bipartisan support, and there's a lot of talk amongst both Republicans and Democrats. I do believe it's possible.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, up next, we're going to have more discussion on compromise and agreement, or gridlock, as the case may be, in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Republican Congressman David Valadao and Democratic Congressman Jim Costa about some areas of agreement or disagreement in next year's Congress. So, Congressman Valadao, you've been an outspoken supporter of comprehensive immigration reform in the Republican caucus. Do you think you're going to be able to convince enough of your colleagues to pass comprehensive immigration reform in the next Congress?
I mean, that varies. It depends on so many things that are going on right now. With the president threatening the executive order and turning it into just a huge political issue of football is pretty scary. I mean, there's a real opportunity to get it done. Yes, there's a lot of members. A lot in our leadership are actually interested in getting it done. There are a lot of members that I work with on a daily basis, and we talk looking for more and more support. Obviously, it's a tough issue, but we've got to find some common ground, especially with the president, and look for a more open dialogue versus this behind-the-scenes signing executive orders, which could be very, very bad for the whole debate nationally.
Let me ask you, Congressman Costa,
I
do you
hope
see...
David's right, that we can get a bipartisan reform on immigration. But let me give you the president's perspective, because I've had these conversations with him. You know, he's getting an incredible amount of pressure from Hispanic groups to basically do what the bipartisan Senate bill was last Congress. And I think he's limited in terms of what he can do in terms of an executive order. But regardless of what happens, whatever he does, it will not be far enough for the activist groups, and it will be too far for the other group that David said. And that's why we really need to work on some legislation together. He hinted at that yesterday, but he also said he was going to, if there wasn't progress, he would take executive order. In either case, he's not going to make either sides happy, and it could be polarizing.
Well, let me go to a topic maybe that people can get around and agree on. That is trade. You mentioned it a little earlier. What bipartisan proposals on trade do you think we might see?
Well, both they're both moving in current tracks. Both the 10-country Asian agreement that is further ahead, and then the European trade agreement with the U.S. And next year, there'll be early on, I think, a key vote that determines whether or not we give fast-track status. Because I think there is a bipartisan group that would put the votes together, giving the president fast-track status, which is simply whenever the final package comes back, both on the European trade agreement and the Asian, that the Congress either votes it up or down. Otherwise, we'll cherry pick it to piece and we'll never get an agreement. That's what fast track means.
Okay. Congressman Valadao, what about energy? Do you see any bipartisan compromises there?
Yes. Energy is a big issue across the country, and it creates a lot of jobs. And even like Keystone Pipeline and a lot of the energy production that goes on around the country, a lot of these states, this creates so many jobs. And even during our water debate with Endangered Species Act and the fact that Endangered Species Act plays a huge role in that, there are a lot of senators and a lot of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle that were very vocal on having to make some adjustments there so that we can make sure that our country is energy independent.
Congressman Costa, let me ask you this. What about, you mentioned a little earlier about tax reform, the possibility of comprehensive tax reform or some kind of change in the system. What do you see might be possible in terms of tax reform?
Well, when we go back for the lame duck session, we're going to have to respond on a number of tax extenders. And what happens there, I think, is not clear at this point in time. But next year, Congressman Camp in this session put together, I think, a thoughtful proposal that was balanced in terms of revenue and brought a lot of reforms. As a result of that, it became very controversial because everybody agrees that we ought to make our tax code simpler and fairer. And but then once you get past those two matters, then the disagreements start.
And what is simple and what is fair, I guess, is the question. Congressman Valadao, what do you think? Do you think we're going to see tax reform?
Yes, and Dave Camp from Michigan retired, so he will no longer serve in the 114th Congress. But yeah, he did put a proposal forward. There was a lot of support and there was a lot of disagreement in it as well. But the fact that there's a framework out there, something that we can look at and negotiate at the table, is a good start. And most members agree that there has to be something done quickly because there's a lot of money outside of our country that can create a lot of jobs, come back in. I mean, you're hearing so many different stories where there's actual money available for lots of investment and creating lots of private sector jobs. And unless we do something quickly, we're missing out on a lot of opportunities.
Even the president indicated that's an area that we might find agreement.
So the corporate tax rate, you're talking about maybe a new rate, how to tax U.S. companies, overseas profits, which tax loopholes to close, those are the kinds of things will be the issues discussed?
Yes, there's a lot of that going on. And when it comes to loopholes, there are so many out there that have to be looked at, and some of them probably closed. But we've got to lower the overall tax rate so that we're competitive in the world. And that will give us the ability to close some of those loopholes because we do have to run a government, we do have to operate, keep our country safe. I mean, there's a lot of things that tax revenue is very important for, and I think Republicans and Democrats agree that you can't operate a government on nothing.
I think there are probably a lot of tax attorneys and accountants that I know that are saying, wait a second, we make our living off those loopholes. So when we come back, we'll talk about running for office and how that may have changed over the last few years, and why, despite record amounts of money being spent on campaigns, voter apathy is at an all-time high. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. How has campaigning for elected office changed? We're talking to two politicians who recently ran the election gauntlet, Democratic Congressman Jim Costa and Republican Congressman David Valadao. So, Congressman Costa, did California and the nation's shifting demographics play any role in the midterm elections?
Well, I mean, when you look at the national scene, a number of states as it relates to the electoral college map are changing. More states are becoming purple, like Florida, Colorado, other states. And so, I mean, demographics continue to change in a place like California as well. But I think what really had an impact, besides the fact that the president's popularity numbers have dropped and Congress's numbers have dropped and people's feelings that institutions can actually perform and do the jobs they're supposed to, is there's less confidence in. And I think that all adds together for a lot of apathy. I mean, we're looking at perhaps a record lowest turnout in California's history, 30%. And I think that apathy is, I mean, we spend a lot of money on campaigns, and walking people's homes and people saying, you know, I mean, 2 or 3 times, phoning people at their homes and saying, don't call me anymore, you've called me 4 times. You know, I'm not gonna vote. So I think there's a lot of overkill in that sense, and I think the low turnout reflected that.
Congressman Valadao, let me ask you about this. There's more voting by mail. How has that changed the way politicians campaign?
It's stretched the amount of time that we're fighting over those votes. I mean, you've got now, instead of just one day where you're trying to get the vote out, you've got almost a month. And it's a lot of time spent making sure that the ballots are being turned in, because we do know at the county once a ballot goes through and gets checked off the list, but we chase ballots and we make sure that people are turning out the vote. It is hard to get people to do it, though.
Yeah, you know,
and you have earlier television, you have earlier mail, because once those mail ballots get to the home, you know, you got a certain percentage that vote in that first week, another percentage that vote in the second week, and you know, and if you wait to your television the last 2 weeks in your mail, you may miss a certain percentage of the voters.
Yeah, I ran track in high school and college, and you always want to get way out in front to make the race hopefully a little easier, and maybe that's the same thing in politics. Let me ask you, Congressman Costa, about the influence of money. In many instances, outside PACs spent more money on legislative races than the candidates themselves. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't think it's a good thing. I disagree with Citizens United that it really has created the environment for these outside PACs. I've heard that in this election cycle, there was $4 billion spent in campaigns across the country. $4 billion. I got to think that money it could be put to better use than enriching political consultants and media companies and mailers. You know, we've gotten away from, I think, what it really takes. I mean, it becomes a whole sales pitch, and very complex and very technical. And I think that, in some ways, turns people off.
Yeah, the Center for Responsive Politics cited that $4 billion figure, and they said it's the most expensive midterm ever. So, Congressman Valadao, despite all this money that's being spent in the November election, record for midterm elections, voter apathy at record highs. So how do we get more people engaged in the political process?
You know, and I can't speak for everybody, but in my district, I've done everything in my power to reach out and talk to voters, especially through my time as a member of Congress. Things as simple as my community coffees, where we'll literally call 3,000 to 4,000 people for every single one of them. Mobile office hours. My teletown halls, where we'll call 30,000 or 40,000 people in the evening just to have a personal conversation with them, and they'll be on the phone with me for about an hour. But it's a struggle, because when you get on social media, people are more interested in celebrities. They're more interested in some of the funny videos or whatever else may be out there, other than an issue that's important to the district and the community they live in. And it's a struggle. A lot of the money is being spent. Yes, it was an expensive campaign, but it's so hard to touch people now, because it used to be years ago there was 3 or 4 networks, only 3 or 4 stations to check through. Now you've got hundreds and hundreds of satellite channels, and you've got every website possible. You've got everything floating around. And so to try to get the majority of the folks, it gets more and more expensive every year.
So I try the same efforts that David does, and I think we're coming to grips with different voting patterns with different age groups. Certainly the social media and how you reach out to younger voters is a key, and you know, the fastest voting bloc continues to be those people who consider themselves independent voters, regardless if they're a Democrat or Republican, and many of them just put it out there. I'm going to decline to state.
So I'm going to ask both of you one last question. We've only got a minute left in the segment,
Okay.
and that is, in 2 years there's going to be another election for Congress. How should voters evaluate the performance of our elected officials?
Well, they've got to follow the issues. I mean, we would love to get every single piece of legislation we personally introduce through, but pay attention to their voting records. Pay attention to what's actually, what they're doing, how much time they're spending on issues important to them, if it has to do with the local veteran, if it has to do with legislation that's important in the Valley. Don't follow the national trends, follow your local trends.
Yeah, I think Tip O'Neill said it best, all politics are local, and at the end of the day, we're judged by our work product. And it begins with your casework that you do every day for your constituents, focusing on the economy of this valley, and that's tied to water, is going to be key toward how successful we are in the next 2 years.
Well, I want to thank Congressman Jim Costa and Congressman David Valadao for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can sign up for a free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org.
And now, another perspective.
I'm Paul Hurley, former community conversation editor for the Visalia Times-Delta, and a member of the board of the Kenneth L. Maddy Institute. The midterm elections were much ado about very little in terms of public policy or the identities of the policymakers. In California, Democrats retained control of the state government, barely. Incumbents were returned to office and few seats changed political parties. Nationally, Republicans won a majority in the Senate and now control both houses of Congress. In both cases, the focus was on completing a dominant position of one party over the other. Politics and public governance has become more concerned with maintaining control than advancing public policy. In that view, the goal is the election itself. What if we looked at it a different way? Suppose the goal was in developing public policy and in doing the public's business. In that view, the election is only the beginning, not the end. In fact, with the election over, it's time for those whom the people chose to be their leaders to do the work they were elected to do. Work for the public's benefit, not their parties and not their supporters or campaign contributors. They represent all the people. Leadership in the making of law require compromise and consensus. Policy that serves all people best must consider opposing viewpoints. Winning an election does not make a leader. Serving the public makes leaders. Senator Ken Maddy believed in working with competing interests from both parties and all constituencies to forge public policy that best serves the most people. The Maddy Institute is dedicated to educating public policy and open discussion of issues from all sides in an effort to find the best position that will serve the most people in California. With the votes counted and the winners declared, the real work of governing and leadership begins. Time will tell how the newly elected meet the challenge. It is hoped that whatever party they claim, our leaders remember that the people of all viewpoints also deserve to be heard and to be served. For the Maddy Report, I'm Paul Hurley.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.